The winter sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a copper glow over the wide plains and the small wooden cabin that stood alone on the edge of the frontier. The land was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that carried hunger, hardship, and the weight of survival. Snow stretched across the prairie like a thin blanket, crunching beneath the feet of a widow and her 2 young children as they gathered what little firewood they could find. Life out here was unforgiving, and every day was a fight to keep hunger and cold from stealing what little they had left. The woman wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Glancing back at the cabin where her children waited, her little boy clung to a small bundle of sticks he had managed to gather, his face pink from the cold, while his younger sister held an old stuffed doll so tightly it looked as though she feared the wind itself might snatch it away. Their lives had been changed forever the day their husband and father did not return from the fields. Since then, the widow had carried every burden on her back, holding her children close and hoping her will alone would be enough to see them through. That evening, as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange sound carried across the open field. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the call of a crow. It was low and broken, the sound of pain carried on the cold air. The widow froze, clutching her shawl. Her first thought was fear of raiders, of outlaws, of the dangers every settler whispered about in hushed tones when the night grew to still. But then she saw him. Lying in the snow not far from her cabin was a man, an Apache warrior, his clothes torn, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. His dark hair was tangled, his skin pale from blood loss, and his once strong hands clutched weakly at the earth beneath him. The sight sent a shiver through her body. On the frontier, stories of conflict between settlers and Apache were spoken often. Some settlers would say such a man was an enemy and leave him to die. Others would warn that helping him could bring danger upon them all. But as she looked at the figure sprawled helplessly in the snow, she did not see an enemy. She saw a human life slipping away before her eyes. And in the wide loneliness of the prairie, where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers, she knew she had only moments to choose. Her children stood silently behind her, their wide eyes fixed on the wounded man. The little girl whispered a question, her small voice trembling, and the widow knew she could not turn away. Without another thought, she knelt beside the warrior. His lips moved, though no sound came, and his hand weakly reached out before falling limp again. She pressed her hand against his chest and felt the faint beat of a heart still fighting, still refusing to surrender. A decision weighed heavy on her spirit: bring this man into her home and risk everything, or leave him to the cold and the snow. Her children's frightened faces swam before her eyes, but so too did the memory of her husband's last words, spoken with warmth even as hardship closed in. We survive out here by holding on to one another, with strength she did not know she still carried. The widow called for her son to help. Together, they pulled the Apache warrior toward the cabin. Every step was a struggle, every drag of his body across the snow a reminder of the risk they were taking. When at last they laid him near the fire, the children huddled close, watching silently as their mother tore strips from an old blanket to press against his wounds. The cabin filled with the sounds of crackling fire, the shallow breaths of the warrior, and the whispers of children who did not understand but trusted their mother's choice. Outside, the prairie night grew colder, the winds harsher, and the stars brighter in the wide-open sky. Inside, a fragile thread of hope flickered in the form of a dying man they had chosen not to abandon. The widow knew that this choice might bring consequences she could not yet imagine. Perhaps others would come looking for him. Perhaps her kindness would be repaid with danger. But in that moment, she felt something stirred deep within her, something stronger than fear. It was the quiet strength of mercy, the belief that compassion could stand against even the harshest trials. The Apache warrior stirred, his eyes flickering open for the briefest moment, meeting hers with a look that held both pain and gratitude. Then they closed again, leaving her uncertain if he would see another sunrise. The fire crackled louder as if it too carried the weight of the silence that followed. Her children leaned against her, their small hands gripping her arms, waiting for answers she could not yet give. And as the wind howled against the wooden walls of their little cabin, one question remained, heavy and unspoken in the air. Had saving this dying warrior sealed their fate? Or had it just changed their lives forever? The fire burned low in the small cabin, throwing shadows across the rough-hewn walls as the widow sat close to the Apache warrior, watching for any sign of change. His breath was shallow, uneven, but still there. She had seen men fade fast when wounds were deep, and part of her feared she was only holding on to a flicker that would not last until morning. Yet there was something in the set of his face, even in weakness, that told her he was no ordinary man. His spirit seemed to cling stubbornly to life, as if he had unfinished business waiting for him on this earth. Her children had finally drifted into uneasy sleep, curled together beneath their threadbare blankets. She sat near them, torn between worry for the stranger and the quiet guilt of the risks she had taken. She had pulled him in from the snow, laid him by her fire, and bound his wounds with strips of cloth. But what if he was found by his own people? What if they thought she had caused his injuries? What if the neighbors, scarce as they were, discovered she had harbored an Apache in her home? She pushed the thoughts away for now. What weighed heavier on her heart was the question of whether he would even see another. Sunrise through the night she tended him carefully, melting snow for water, offering him a few sips when he stirred. She whispered soft prayers, though she wondered if prayers could cross the gulf between their worlds. More than once she thought she saw his lips move faintly, perhaps forming words in a tongue she could not understand. Each time, she hushed her children from waking, not wanting their fear to grow stronger. When dawn finally broke, it came with a pale light that spilled across the snow-covered plains. The warrior opened his eyes fully for the first time since she had found him. His gaze was sharp, dark, and searching, though weak with pain. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at her, then shifted his eyes toward the children who still clung together near the fire. There was no hatred in his stare, no trace of threat. Only a heavy weariness, mixed with something she could not name. She spoke gently, though she doubted he understood. "You are safe here. I will help you." The words felt small, almost foolish, but it was all she had. He closed his eyes again, though his hand moved faintly. As if in gratitude, the widow's thoughts wandered back to her husband. She remembered the way he used to speak of the land and all its people. He had never called the Apache their enemies, only neighbors with different ways. He had believed in a kind of respect between men, even when hardship pressed against them all. Perhaps that memory had pushed her to bring the warrior in. Or perhaps it was simply that she could not stand the sight of another human life slipping away. As the day wore on, it's just she learned more about the weight of her decision. The warrior was not just hurt. His wounds bore signs of battle, and not the kind that came from wild animals. The cuts were clean, deep, and deliberate. Someone had wanted him gone. The thought sent unease crawling up her spine. If others had been with him, if there had been a fight, then danger was not far behind. Her boy asked questions she struggled to answer. Why is he here? Will he hurt us? She told him softly that sometimes people needed help, and it was not for them to decide who deserved it. The child's eyes lingered on the warrior with a mix of fear and curiosity. The way children often look at things they cannot yet understand. The little girl, however, seemed less afraid. She sat near the fire, clutching her doll, watching the wounded man with innocent wonder, as though she sensed something different about him. As the warrior's strength returned in small measures, he began to stir more often. At times he seemed restless, muttering words in his native tongue, his eyes darting as if he saw things that were not there. Other times he lay in silence, his face calm as though he trusted the walls that sheltered him. The widow found herself studying him more closely. There was a scar along his arm, a mark that told of battles fought long before this one. His hands, though rough and strong, carried a gentleness when they moved in his restless sleep, as if they remembered work beyond war. The days were long and uncertain. She rationed food carefully, for there was little enough for her children. The choice to feed him meant they all had to endure more hunger, but she made the sacrifice without question. Each night she sat awake longer, listening for sounds beyond the cabin. The howl of coyotes was normal, the whistle of wind through the cracks familiar. But any new sound made her grip her shawl tighter. She knew the land was alive with more than animals. Settlers, riders, scouts, any of them could appear, and the sight of an Apache under her roof could bring ruin. Yet, despite the fear, something else began to grow quietly inside her. Each time she looked at the warrior, she felt a stirring of hope she did not fully understand. Perhaps it was because his survival meant that mercy had not been wasted. Or perhaps it was because she sensed that his presence, though dangerous, was not without meaning. One evening, as the sky burned orange over the plains, the warrior tried to speak. His voice was rough, weak, but she leaned close to hear. The words were broken, his accent thick, yet she caught pieces simple. Halting English he must have learned somewhere. You. Help. Why? His eyes fixed on hers, waiting for an answer. Her throat tightened. She searched for the right words, words he might understand. At last she said, "Because you were dying, and because no one should be left alone." For a long moment, he only stared. Then slowly his head bowed, as if he carried a weight heavier than his wounds. That night, when the children were asleep, she sat by the fire and thought about what his presence meant. There was a story written in his scars, in the broken words he forced out, the way his eyes darkened when he looked at the horizon. She did not yet know it, but she felt its weight pressing against her home, shaping her family's future in ways she could not yet see. The prairie was never kind, and the rules of survival were strict. Yet here in her cabin, mercy had taken root, fragile but unyielding. And with every passing day, she began to wonder if this choice she had made, this act of saving a stranger, was not just about him. Perhaps it was about all of them, about her children, about the land itself. Perhaps it was the start of something far larger than she dared to imagine. Still, she lay awake listening to the warrior's steady breath. Unease curled inside her heart. For though she had saved his life, she knew nothing of what storms he might bring to her door once his strength returned. And out there, beyond the glow of her cabin fire, the wild land waited with secrets of its own. Would the risk of kindness protect them, or had she unknowingly invited danger that would soon come knocking? The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, though every heartbeat inside the little cabin carried a weight of uncertainty. The widow rose early to tend to her children, splitting what little cornmeal remained into thin portions. She melted snow for water, chopped firewood until her hands blistered, and stitched torn clothing by the dim light of the fire. But always her eyes would drift back to the Apache warrior resting near the hearth. His wounds, though deep, were beginning to knit together under her care. He was still weak, but there was a new steadiness in his gaze, a fire returning to his spirit. Her boy kept his distance, hovering near the window or clutching a stick as if it were a weapon. He whispered to his sister that they should be careful, that warriors were dangerous men who carried knives and bows. The little girl, however, showed no such fear. She often crept close, sitting quietly beside the warrior, sometimes offering him her doll as though it might bring him comfort. The widow watched these exchanges with mixed feelings. Her son's suspicion was natural, perhaps wise, yet her daughter's innocence reminded her of something she had long forgotten: trust without condition. Outside, the land itself seemed to mirror the tension within the cabin. Winter winds swept across the plains with a sharp bite, rattling the wooden shutters and seeping through the cracks in the walls. Coyotes howled at night, their cries echoing across the barren fields. But it was not the animals or the weather that stirred the widow's deepest unease. It was the thought of other men settlers, riders, or worse, discovering what she had hidden in her home. One morning, as the children gathered sticks from the edge of the woods, the boy returned with wide eyes and breathless words. He had seen tracks in the snow horses, more than one, passing not far from their cabin. The widow's heart tightened. She knew the land was patrolled often, not only by wandering settlers, but sometimes by soldiers or men who called themselves protectors of the frontier. If they caught sight of an Apache recovering under her roof, there would be no mercy for her or her children. That evening, the warrior tried once more to speak, his English broken but clearer than before. He pointed toward the door, his eyes sharp. "Men, you, danger." His voice was hoarse, but the meaning needed no explanation. He knew others were searching. Whether they were his own people or enemies, she could not tell. She only knew that their quiet world was no longer hidden. The widow felt torn in ways she could not express. Part of her wished to send him away, to free her family from the shadow of his presence. Yet she knew he would not survive alone in the snow, not in his condition. Another part of her, deeper and harder to name, wondered if fate had brought him to her door for a reason. Her husband had always said that life out here was not about choosing the easy path, but the right one. Even when the right path was full of danger, as the warrior regained strength, he began to move around the cabin in small steps. He leaned against the walls, testing his balance, his breath still heavy with effort. The children watched him with wary fascination. The boy kept his distance, though he never let his mother out of sight, as if ready to protect her at any moment. The girl, bold as ever, followed the warrior with curious eyes, speaking to him in simple words, as though convinced he understood. Sometimes he gave her a faint smile, and the widow wondered what memories stirred in his mind when he looked at her small face. But outside forces were closing in. Days later, as the sun dipped low, the widow saw smoke curling on the horizon. It was not from her fire, nor from any neighbor she knew. It was distant, but its meaning was clear. Others were nearby. Whether they were settlers or Apache, the threat was the same. Her heart pounded as she shut the shutters tight and urged her children to stay inside. The warrior, too, noticed. His eyes narrowed, and though his body was still frail, his instincts had returned. He whispered words she could not understand, then fell into silence, as if listening for sounds beyond her hearing. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every crack of wood, every howl of wind sent her heart racing. She sat by the fire, clutching the small rifle her husband had left behind. She knew little about using it, but she held it all the same. The warrior, resting on his mat, seemed to sense her unease. His dark eyes met hers across the dim room, and though no words passed between them, quiet understanding filled the space. Days stretched into weeks, and the warrior's strength grew. He began to help in small ways, carrying water, chopping small pieces of wood, mending broken tools with surprising skill. The children watched with wide eyes as he worked. It was strange seeing the one they feared becoming part of their daily survival. Still, the widow knew the danger had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened. The tracks in the snow returned, and once she thought she heard the distant sound of horses at night. She prayed silently that whoever roamed the plains would pass them by. The boy grew restless, his fear turning to anger. One evening, he confronted his mother, his voice breaking as he asked why she risked their lives for a stranger. "He is not one of us," the child cried. "If they find him here, they will hurt us too." The widow held him close, her heart aching at his words. She had no easy answer, only the quiet belief that mercy could not be abandoned. Even when the world pressed against them, the warrior, though he did not understand every word, seemed to grasp the weight of the boy's protest. Later that night, he sat by the fire and whispered a few words of English, halting but clear. "I go. You safe?" His hand rested against his chest, his gaze heavy with meaning. He was willing to leave, to take the burden from them. The widow shook her head. "Not yet. You are not strong enough." She could see in his eyes that he wanted to argue, but his body betrayed him with weakness. For now he remained, yet she knew the moment of choice was drawing near. The smoke on the horizon, the tracks in the snow, the whispers of danger, they were not passing threats. They were signs of something larger, something that would soon force its way into their lives. The prairie was vast, but it offered no true hiding. Every life on the frontier was tied together by the threads of survival, and sooner or later, those threads pulled tight. The widow could not tell what the future held, but she knew their fragile world would not remain untouched. The warrior's presence was no longer a secret kept between the four walls of her cabin. It was a spark hidden in the snow, waiting for the wind to turn. Would her act of mercy ignite hope or unleash a fire that none of them could escape? The winter grew harsher as the days crept on, and the silence of the prairie became heavier than ever before. Each morning, the widow stepped outside her cabin, scanning the horizon with a cautious eye. The world looked empty, yet she knew it was not. The signs were everywhere: faint tracks in the snow, broken branches in the woods, smoke that rose and faded in the distance. Whoever was out there had not moved on. They lingered, watching, waiting, and the weight of their unseen presence pressed against her chest like a stone. Inside the cabin, life was no less tense. The Apache warrior's strength had returned, though not completely. He no longer lay helpless near the fire. Instead, he moved with steady purpose, helping to carry wood, sharpening tools, and watching over the children when the widow's work pulled her away. His quiet nature unsettled her son, who still looked at him with suspicion. Yet the boy's eyes betrayed something else, to a growing awareness that this man, now once broken and near death, was now stronger than any of them. Strength could be a shield, but it could also be a threat. The little girl, unshaken by fear, grew even closer to the warrior. She followed him like a shadow, showing him her small treasures, tugging at his hand to sit with her by the fire and babbling to him in words he half understood. The widow watched, torn between relief that her daughter felt safe and dread that such innocence might lead to heartbreak. For deep down, she knew this peace could not last. The nights were the worst. The winds rattled the shutters, and every distant sound carried a warning. More than once, the widow woke to find the warrior standing at the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hand resting near the knife he carried. When she asked what he saw, his answer was always the same: men. That single word held all the meaning she needed. He knew, just as she did, that danger was drawing nearer with each passing day. One afternoon, the boy returned from the woods, pale-faced and trembling. He had gone only a short way to fetch firewood, but what he saw left him shaken. He spoke of riders, 2 of them, their shapes moving against the snow. They had not come close, but they were near enough to see the cabin if they chose. The widow's heart pounded as she listened. She wanted to believe they might pass by, but she had lived too long on the frontier to trust in such luck. Out here, nothing happened without reason. That evening, as the fire cast its glow on the cabin walls, the warrior sat across from her and spoke in slow, careful English. His words came halting, but clear enough to understand. They look. For me, he tapped his chest, then gestured toward the horizon. His gaze was sharp, unwavering. Bad men. Not my people. Soldiers or others. They want blood. The widow felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She had always known that harboring him carried risks, but hearing him speak the truth aloud made it heavier than ever before. He was not just a man she had saved. He was the center of something larger, something violent, and it was coming closer to her home. Her boy, overhearing, clenched his fists. If they come, they will kill us too. His words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they carried the plain, honest fear of a child. The widow pulled him close, whispering words of comfort she hardly believed herself. She glanced at the warrior, who sat silent once more, his dark eyes lowered. There was something in his expression she had not seen before, an unspoken promise. Or perhaps a burden too heavy to name. Days later, the first real sign appeared. At dawn, smoke drifted in the distance, closer than before. The widow watched from her doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, her breath trembling in the icy air. This was not the smoke of a wandering camp. It was too near, too deliberate. Whoever was out there had chosen their place, and they were not leaving. The warrior noticed too. He stood beside her, his jaw set, his posture tense. He said nothing, but the air between them spoke louder than words. The children huddled inside, their wide eyes following every movement. Sensing the storm building around them, the tension seeped into every corner of the cabin. The widow slept little, her rifle always within reach. The boy began keeping watch from the window, his young face hardened by fear. Even the girl grew quieter, her laughter fading as she clutched her doll and stayed close to her mother. The warrior, though stronger now, seemed restless, pacing often, his ears tuned to sounds beyond their hearing. One night, as the fire burned low, the sound of horses broke through the silence. Faint at first, then clearer, the the steady rhythm of hooves pressing against the snow. The widow froze, her breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the warrior, who had already risen, his knife in hand, his body rigid with focus. The children stirred, their eyes wide with terror. The sound passed slowly, then faded into the distance. But the fear it left behind remained heavy in the air. The widow knew then that time was running out. Whatever fate waited on the horizon was drawing closer, and soon there would be no choice left to make. In the following days, the warrior began preparing in quiet ways. He fashioned arrows from scraps of wood, sharpened his knife against stone, taught the boy how to move silently, how to listen for sounds hidden in the wind. At first the boy resisted, his fear tangled with anger. But slowly he began to follow, his small hands learning skills no child should need. The widow watched this with a heavy heart. Torn between pride in her son's courage and sorrow for the childhood slipping away too quickly, the girl, too young to understand fully, clung to her mother more often, her wide eyes watching as the world around her changed. She sensed the tension, though she could not name it. At night she whispered, "Will they come here?" And the widow had no answer to give. She only held her daughter tighter, praying silently for strength. The smoke grew thicker on the horizon, the signs more frequent. Once, the boy spotted figures moving in the distance, though too far to name. Another time, the warrior returned with news of tracks boots, not moccasins, cutting across the snow. Whoever hunted him was not Apache. These were men who carried rifles and rode with purpose. The widow's fear deepened, but so too did her resolve. She knew her choice had tied her fate to the warriors, and now there was no turning back. Each night, she sat by the fire, watching her children sleep, listening to the wind howl against the cabin walls, and wondering how close the danger truly was. The warrior often sat beside her, silent, yet his presence steady. Once in a rare moment, he spoke softly. "You saved me. Now I save you." His words were few, but they carried a weight that echoed in her chest. She could not tell if his promise gave her comfort or only deepened her fear. The days stretched thinner, the tension wound tighter. Every sound outside seemed louder, every shadow longer. The widow felt the world closing in, pressing her toward a moment she could not yet see, but could no longer avoid. Then, one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the boy returned breathless from the woods. His voice shook as he cried out, "They're close. I saw them, soldiers." His words fell heavy in the cabin. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of fire. The widow's heart thundered as she gathered her children close. The warrior stood tall, his body tense, his eyes burning with a fire she had not seen before. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and empty. But she knew it was no longer theirs alone. The storm had come to their doorstep, the boys. Words hung in the air like the toll of a bell. "Soldiers." The widow felt her breath catch, and for a long moment, the cabin seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing closer as the weight of what was coming settled on her shoulders. She pulled her daughter near, holding the small, trembling body close, while her son stood rigid, his young face pale with fear, but set with a stubborn kind of courage. The warrior rose from his place by the fire, his knife glinting faintly in the low light. He did not panic. He did not tremble. Instead, he moved with the quiet focus of a man who had seen danger many times before. His dark eyes locked on the widow's, and though no words were spoken, the meaning was clear. The moment of choice had come. Outside, the crunch of boots against snow grew louder, joined by the heavy breath of horses. Voices carried across the cold air, sharp and commanding. The widow could not make out every word, but she heard enough to understand. They were searching, calling to one another, speaking of tracks that led toward her cabin. Her heart pounded. She clutched the small rifle her husband had left behind, its weight both strange and familiar in her hands. She had fired it only once in her life, years ago, when he had taught her how. Now, it was all that stood between her children and whatever fate these soldiers brought. The warrior stepped to the door and paused, his hand resting against the rough wood. He looked back at the children huddled near their mother, then back at her, His gaze softened for the briefest moment, as if he carried their faces in his heart. Then he straightened, his posture tall and unyielding. The widow whispered, "Stay. If you go out there, they will kill you." He shook his head slowly, then touched his chest and spoke in broken English. "They come for me. It's not you. I end this." Before she could answer, a heavy knock shook the door. A voice rang out, sharp and demanding. "Open up." "In the name of the law." The widow froze, her hands tightening on the rifle. Her son pressed close, whispering, "Don't, Mama." Her daughter whimpered softly, clutching her doll. The warrior's eyes burned with quiet resolve. He whispered words she did not fully understand, but she caught the meaning. Trust. The door swung open before she could move, and the cold night air rushed in. 3 soldiers stood there, their coats heavy, rifles slung across their shoulders. Their eyes swept the cabin, landing on the warrior with immediate recognition. One of them stepped forward, his face hard. "That's him," the soldier said. "Apache fighter. Dangerous man. Step aside, miss. He's coming with us." The widow's breath shook, but she did not move. She lifted the rifle, her hands trembling, and placed herself between the soldiers and the warrior. "He's wounded. He's done nothing to you. Leave him be." The soldiers exchanged looks, a mixture of surprise and irritation. The man in front sneered. "He's killed settlers, maybe even women and children. You want to protect him, lady? Then you share his guilt." Her knees felt weak, but she did not lower the rifle. "He was dying in the snow. I saved him. If that is guilt, then I carry it. But I will not hand him over to die." The leader's face hardened, his hand moving toward his weapon. But before he could draw, the warrior stepped forward. His voice, though rough, rang clear. "No, not her. Not children. Me." He pushed past the widow, standing tall despite his wounds, his head high. The soldiers tightened their grip on their rifles, but for a moment they hesitated. Something in his stance, something in the quiet strength of his presence, made even armed men pause. The widow's heart ached as she reached out, but the warrior did not look back. He spoke one last word to her, soft yet unshaken. "Safe." The soldiers moved quickly, binding his hands, shoving him toward the horses waiting outside. Snow crunched under their boots as they dragged him away. The widow stood frozen in the doorway, her children clutching her skirts, watching helplessly as the man they had saved was taken into the darkness. The cabin felt colder that night than ever before. The fire crackled low, but its warmth could not touch the emptiness left behind. The boy sat silent, his small hands clenched, while the girl whispered questions her mother could not answer. The widow sat between them, her heart heavy, wondering if mercy had been a mistake, or if it had been the only right choice left to her. Days passed in silence, each one stretching longer than the last. The children asked less, though their eyes still searched the horizon whenever they stepped outside. The widow tried to carry on, gathering wood, rationing food, keeping the fire alive, but in quiet moments, she found her gaze drifting to the place where he had lain by the hearth, the space now empty, as though a piece of their small world had been taken with him. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of fire, a sound carried across the plain. Hooves, slow at first, then nearer. The widow's breath caught as she stepped to the doorway, children clinging to her skirts. Out of the fading light came a figure on horseback. It was not the soldiers. It was him, the warrior. His hands were free, his posture strong, his dark eyes fixed on her cabin. He rode closer, then dismounted. Standing tall against the glow of the setting sun, the widow's heart leaped, torn between disbelief and relief. He walked toward her, his steps steady, and for the first time since she had found him in the snow. She saw him not as a wounded stranger, not as a burden, but as a man carrying the weight of survival just as she did. He spoke softly when he reached her, his voice firm but gentle. "They let me go. I fight no more. They see truth. You save me. I save you." Her son stared, wide-eyed, his fear slowly melting into awe. Her daughter smiled, clutching her doll tightly, as if she had known all along he would return. The widow felt tears sting her eyes, though she held them back. She nodded, unable to find the words to match the storm in her heart. That night the cabin felt different. The fire burned brighter, the air warmer. The warrior sat once more near the hearth, not as a dying man, not as a stranger, but as part of their fragile world. The children leaned close, their small bodies finally at ease, and the widow watched with quiet wonder. The prairie outside remained harsh and wild. Danger would always linger, hunger would always threaten, and the wind would always howl against their walls. But something had changed. Mercy had sown something stronger than fear. It had built a bond where none should have been, a bond forged in survival, in trust, in the simple choice to see a man not as an enemy, but as a life worth saving. The widow knew the road ahead would not be easy. Yet as she watched the warrior rest by her fire, she felt a strength within her that she had not known since her husband's passing. It was not just her fight anymore. It was theirs. And in that truth, in that fragile but unyielding bond, lay the promise that even in the coldest winters of the frontier, hope could still rise. The story of a poor widow, her children, and a dying Apache warrior was no longer just survival. It was a reminder that kindness, even in the hardest of times, could change everything.